Welcome to Conversations Along the Way. I'm Luke Freeman. This is a conversation I've been holding on to for about a year now. When I spoke with Brendan last March, I had asked if we could record the conversation for a future podcast I was going to produce. And here we are, 1 year later. The topic of this conversation is Metamodernism, which was a concept that really grabbed hold of me and has not let go since. Unfortunately, I don't do the regular podcast thing and ask Brendan to define metamodernism in this conversation. So I'd recommend you check out his YouTube channel and the videos I'll link in the description if you'd like a little more context. And I have to thank Paul Vanderklay and Christian Baxter for putting Brendan on my radar. What you'll find here is a much more personal conversation where I talk to Brendan about how metamodernism connects with my experience of the Christian faith. As you'll see, the concept did some therapeutic work on me to bring together disparate threads of my spiritual journey. And though Brendan and I are in very different places now, there was so much about his story and trajectory that resonated with my own story. I apologize that I talk about myself way too much at the beginning, so if you want to get more of the dialogue, you can use the timestamps in the description to skip ahead. But if any of this conversation resonates with you, I would highly recommend you visit Brendan's channel and familiarize yourself with his work. He has a brilliant mind, and it was a true honor to have this conversation with him. Also, if you'd ever like to have a conversation with me, either on this podcast or offline, please get in touch. I'm always game for a good, meaningful conversation. I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for your time, Brendan.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it. This is exciting. I'm not sure what this will all head or what uses this conversation will be put to, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you on your inaugural podcast.
And I mean, it feels very one-sided because I've probably listened to, combined like at least 8 hours of you, and you know nothing about me. So
And this is true. Yes.
So I feel like I need to provide a little bit of a thumbnail sketch if you.
I'd love that.
Yes, would be willing to give me the time. Yeah, so I think I gathered we're about the same age. I was born in 89.
What month?
August.
Okay. I'm a May baby.
Okay. Yeah, and one of the conversations you mentioned you're an Enneagram 4, I believe. I'm an Enneagram 1, which the 4 and 1, there can be like a certain compatibility. But yeah, so I grew up in at first it was Methodist, but my family, when I was in like late elementary school, left the Methodist church, and we were a part of non-denominational churches. So like the church I grew up in, kind of where my faith was formed, was a more like charismatic leaning, like non-affiliated, non-denominational church. And so definitely like I resonated with just kind of like the cultural flavor, like the Veggie Tales, the Left Behind, the DC talk, you know.
Yeah.
I felt a little, I don't know, how should I say? I was pushing the limits when I bought my first Green Day album, when I started listening to secular music. So that was definitely like the cultural milieu. And I mean, I remained a Christian through high school, but by that point, my family found I would say kind of an emergent non-denominational church, kind of like in the Rob Bell kind of sphere, which it was interesting. I mean, for me, by the time I was in high school, I had started to encounter a lot of ways in which, the faith tradition I grew up in, my Christianity was kind of rubbing up against like kind of the broader cultural milieu. I went to public school. I'm here in Fayetteville, Arkansas.
I was going to ask. I remember, the state.
Yeah.
I remember, Arkansas.
Yeah, so Fayetteville's a college town, so, definitely a bit of a, progressive island. And I mean, most of my friends were non-Christian, and like a lot of my friends were kind of in the Lit Mag AP scene. And I just was wrestling with a lot of aspects of kind of the Christianity I grew up with that kind of rubbed up against the secular world I was living in. And so
Wait, did you say Lit Mag, like literary magazines?
Yeah.
So you were kind of like a artistically oriented, literary oriented fellow?
I was on the periphery. I was really into photography in high school. So I'd like submit photos for Lit Mag. I feel like I've always had kind of a foot in both worlds where, I had like my Christian identity, but then at school I hung out with like agnostics and atheists and like, that kind of like Lit Mag crowd, but never, I don't know, always felt like I was never fully in one sphere or another. But yeah, anyway, so this whole, the Rob Bell thing, and I mean, like reading Blue Like Jazz, just kind of being on that scene, that that incursion of like kind of postmodern thought resolved some tensions, but like looking back on it, I feel like I never fully entered the postmodern. It
Mm-hmm.
just kind of was it softened, softened
Mm.
the edge. So then in college, I found a church that I found out later was part of the Acts 29. So like the whole Mark Driscoll scene. So definitely more socially conservative. But even then I was rubbing up against kind of like the gender roles. Yeah, even like the whole gender sex complementarianism. I don't know. It just didn't
Mm-hmm.
sit right with me. But it was a great community. I met my wife in school. We got married the summer after our sophomore year. Just had a
Of
lot of
of
support
college.
of college.
Wow,
Yes.
yeah. So yeah. Yeah. What, like 20-ish?
Yeah, when was that? That would have been, oh, you're saying
Meaning 19 years old, 20 years old. Yeah.
Yeah. I was 19, my wife was 20. Yeah, so there was a point when she was buying me beer. Which
Nice.
is yeah, fun dynamic. Yeah, but yeah, and in that context, I mean, in that church, I remember just having issues with like the statement of faith. The pastor there took a pretty hard line on interpretation of Genesis, and
Hmm.
I remember not being able to sign it because I didn't take a literal
Hmm.
interpretation of Genesis. Yeah, I believed in evolution, and anyway, that was a sticking point for me. But I found the community really beautiful, and it
Hmm.
it was a great support to my wife and I as we were
Mhm.
newly married. And anyway, we graduated college together, got a job. I ended up graduating with a degree in agriculture, so got a job on a farm in Oklahoma. And anyway, found our way back to my hometown of Fayetteville after a year of living in the River Valley of Arkansas, and found our way back to this, this emergent like progressive evangelical church, and found a great fit after kind of not loving the more, conservative Acts 29 church we were in. But in that context of being in this post kind of a more like postmodern church, and then also I went back to grad school to study horticulture. And so like being
Hmm.
in a very, rationalist, materialist kind of worldview there, my faith it just kind of slowly dissolved. It's like
Hmm.
a slow disenchantment. And
Were you still going to church during your graduate school days, or did you stop? Or yeah.
yeah, and it was the kind of situation where we were still going to church, had great community there, and loved the people, and I felt like I could still get a lot out of the message. Like the moral teaching still resonated with me, but I just
Mm-hmm.
couldn't believe in the resurrection anymore. Kind of couldn't
Hmm.
believe in the the more mystical, spiritual aspects of the Christianity I grew up with. And I think, viewing at it from something like your framework of like these movements, traditional to modern, I feel like it was very much of the full weight of like the modern worldview. Just yeah, I mean it kind of just it zapped it just
Mm.
zapped the enchantment out of my
Mm.
faith. And another thing that happened around that time was in this church we did these experimental collectives instead of small groups, and we went to some other houses of worship in the area, including an Eastern Orthodox church, and a Hindu temple.
Hmm.
And I was really thrown off by the imagery and all the icons in the Eastern Orthodox church,
Mm.
and saw a lot of similarities between the Eastern Orthodox worship setting and then the Hindu temple,
Mm.
and it kind of felt very pagan to me, and
Mm.
so it made me explore early Christianity, kind of dove into that historical scholarship, found Bart Ehrman, and just anyway that kind of like historical
Mm-hmm.
critical biblical scholarship. Again, that was just another thing that
Yeah.
created a lot of fissures and a lot of doubts.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, it just essentially, yeah, deconstructed like the narrative I had about who Jesus was, Jesus being the Christ. So I was an agnostic, self-proclaimed agnostic for probably, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years or something.
What was that when you self-proclaimed as an agnostic then? Was that sort of like a full-on rupture with your church and community, family, or were people at that point sort of like, oh yeah, we know about Luke. How did that
No,
go?
so I'm very much a peacemaker, like Enneagram. I have a 9 wing. So it was like me on my own, I'm like, we
Mm,
can still go to this church. These are still our friends. I'm just
mhm,
over here, like, I don't really believe all this stuff anymore, but you do. That's great. I don't want to mess with your faith.
mhm,
But I mean, like, even at that church, I like found a few other people who were questioning things, and we had like a little book club where we were reading Sam Harris, his book Waking Up, which was
mhm,
about, spirituality without religion. So I found people I could talk to about it.
mhm,
But yeah, for better or worse, I kind of go through these phases, by myself, or,
mhm,
I find companions along the way. And I think for my parents, it was difficult, but subsequently all my younger siblings, I'm the oldest of four, all my younger siblings have lost their faith in one way or another.
mm,
And my parents kind of went through their own deconstruction in the context of this church, primarily around like LGBTQ issues.
mhm, mhm,
Like the church took a stance being open and affirming, or welcoming and affirming, and so the pastor led the congregation kind of through how he got to that point. And I feel like since then my parents' perspective on scripture has
mm,
really changed.
mm,
But the very interesting thing for me, I mean, all this is kind of like predictable, but I think where I feel like your framework for thinking about this and talking about this, like on a metamodern level, is that, so I've since come back to faith, via Jordan Peterson, but more through like the mythical route. So I got so really interested in Joseph Campbell for a while.
mm, mhm,
The idea of story, myth.
mhm,
To me, what it was doing was it was operating on a level that kind of like my modernist rationalist
mhm,
worldview. It how do I put it? It didn't really know what to do with that, like the
mm,
mythical archetypal, but it was doing something to me. Like I could
mhm,
I could feel it,
mhm,
like just the power of story, the power of myth. And then I found, so then kind of being primed by Joseph Campbell, I found Jordan Peterson and his Genesis lectures, and
mhm.
just the way he was able to incorporate that kind of Jungian archetypes with
Yeah.
psychology, with evolutionary theory, and be kind of providing exegesis of
Mhm,
Genesis of all of all the books. It got me curious in the Bible again. And kind of predictably I found Vervaeke and then Pajot
mhm,
and Paul Vanderklay, and started reading a lot of C.S. Lewis,
mm,
and yeah, found a way to come back to faith that did not, throw out kind of what I had been through in terms of like a modern scientific framework, but
mhm,
added to it,
mhm,
like
mhm,
complemented it. And anyway, since then, my wife and I, we had kids 3 years ago, twin boys. That was also a big part of it, just wrestling with an identity change, being a father,
mm, mhm,
the responsibility around that. What am I going to teach my kids? What kind of moral
mhm,
foundation am I going to give them? And then, found a church. We felt like it was really important to find a church community. But being here in Northwest Arkansas, anyway, we found a non-denominational evangelical church, which is great in a lot of aspects. But I could find myself, being able to affirm a lot about this
mhm,
church, but
mhm,
in some ways, like having a framework for faith that's just, it's not the same,
mhm,
if that makes sense. And anyway, this is where I think your metamodern perspective is really helpful for me, because just what man, I think it was your conversation with Sam Titteman with Transfigured. You
mhm,
talking about like a perspective that contains perspective, or, a lens that contains other lenses. There's a way I find myself, existing in these faith communities that are very much in like the traditionalist or the modernist, which again, there's a lot I can affirm, but then I get to some points where, like, if we're talking about Genesis and evolution, I'm like, I just don't want to have a debate with you about,
mm,
the day being a 24-hour period. Like, that's just not even interesting to me. Like, we can
mhm.
just kind of disagree about that. But
Well, wait,
I think,
I have a question. Well, but I don't want to interrupt. There's a nice, lovely autobiographical flow. So, and I feel like we're also probably getting close to the present. So I don't want to interrupt if you want to finish the narrative part of this. It's great. It's great.
I mean, that pretty much gets to where I am. I
Mhm,
think the part where I feel like just engaging with you knowing my story to some degree, I know, would be helpful, because I feel like there are these disparate aspects of my past, and a lot of the work where I am now is integrating those
Mm.
in the proper way, being able to be kind of like fully myself, but in these different spheres. Like
Did you see that happen with my camera? That
yeah,
was
yeah,
kind of
that
strange,
was
wasn't it?
crazy.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and then at the same time, my family, my parents, and my siblings are very much in the kind of like a postmodern, like still deconstructed, not yet reconstructed, um, phase. And anyway, the beauty I think you've pointed me to is just the ability to see the good in these stages,
Mm.
and to recognize that. But anyway, you seem to have a question, so.
Yeah, I was just curious, like, a lot of the things that's been coming up for some people about the stuff that I'm talking about is there's a lot of pushback or struggle with the idea around miracles and the resurrection. You'd said earlier that you kind of felt like that didn't happen. So I'm curious where your thoughts are with that now. Like, what do you in like the gospel in the gospels, right? Not just the resurrection, but other like miracle accounts. Is that a really important thing to affirm for you, or you're just sort of like, nah, I don't really necessarily think those things happen, but it's not really that important, or you take it archetypally? Like, what's your thinking about that?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I'd say I I believe they happened, but like my faith would not fall apart if there was some kind of, historical, scientific, archaeological evidence that said it didn't happen. If that makes sense. It's like
Hmm.
it's a loosely holding to the historical, because for me what has most salience is something like the spiritual archetypal.
So how did reading the Airmen and having that whole modern disenchantment and the whole doing the horticultural studies and all that and that mindset, how did you how did you go through that in a place where you could land again where you're on like cool with the miracle aspect?
Yeah, I know. I'm honestly still working through this. So
No, it is.
I love these questions. I love these questions. It's great. Yeah, I mean that definitely was like a deconstruction.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I was definitely at a point where, I thought miracles don't happen, the resurrection didn't happen. Jesus was something like a zealot or, apocalyptic prophet. But man, I think for me there's something like a re-enchantment that happened to me. I mean, I read Charles Taylor, A Secular Age,
That's a good one.
getting into myth, and it's almost and this is weird. I don't know if this is like a postmodern frame, but it's like I want these stories to be true so badly I believe they are true.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? I mean,
Sure.
I would rather live in a world where spirits and fairies exist.
Mhm.
Where there is a spirit to the forest. There's something like a spirit to the forest.
Well, that's
Then
something
one.
like does a lot of work there,
Yeah,
That's the
yeah,
whole
yeah.
thing. And I think like for me, the whole project of reenchantment has been a huge one. And in some ways, I still kind of conceive of my work through that lens. But it's all about, devil's in the details, fairies in the details, gods in the details, right? So it's sort of like I do believe there is something like, the spirit of the woods. But I actually think that, it matters a lot how we conceive of those things if we want to avoid sort of like a kind of move back into some like more simplistic animistic thinking versus a move forward into like more complex systems thinking, if that makes sense, right?
Oh
And
yeah.
that move is like the key thing. But
Oh yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. 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 And man, so I've been listening to a lot of your content. The one thing that I I didn't get, I just started this morning, was about catechesis,
hmm
like modern Christianity. And I essentially got until maybe what is it, 8 to 12 a year, phase. But I think one thing that really resonated with me was, thinking about raising children in this enchanted world where Santa is real. And I think for me, the way I see miracles is like an ability to inhabit that,
mm.
and an ability to inhabit a world where Santa Claus is real. Whereas I'm not gonna, get out my radar and be looking for Santa,
But why not?
on Christmas Eve. Like on that level,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I get you.
I
Yeah, yeah.
but for example, yeah, my master's is in horticulture, so I love plants. I really got into it because I wanted to learn to farm, and we've got 3 acres out here in Northwest Arkansas, and got something
Nice.
like a hobby farm, and yeah, just
Cool.
raising our boys on the land is really important, and so got a garden and chickens, and
Awesome.
we had goats for a while, but
Did they eat everything?
and
Yeah.
that's why we got rid of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so I think there are ways where I can be outside and feel like kind of this spirit, like kind of the spirit of the land or like the spirit of a tree. But if I'm farming and I'm making plans or I'm thinking about management, I'm not taking that into account.
Kind of
So
toggling
it's a
into a different.
toggling.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, yeah. And I think that's a framing that you have that I found really helpful. It's in some ways it can feel a little schizophrenic, but I think it's almost it's context dependent. And one thing that I feel like, I mean, how it relates to faith is like inhabiting these stories. I mean, for example, just kind of experiencing the liturgical cycle has been really meaningful for me over the past few years. And kind of experiencing the Advent story, the Nativity, um, and even, the narratives of the wise men, experiencing that, inhabiting that without it having to be historically true. If that makes sense. But there is something incredibly meaningful and powerful in inhabiting that story and kind of experiencing that magic, which is true. It's true to on some level, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me, so different tack would be, I guess, trying to think about some good questions around this would be, but there's like an aspect of this I want to. Do you feel like you are flourishing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, as
I don't
much as
mean
I
this
can be,
moment, but
as
in
much as I
life.
can be with twin toddlers who are 3 years old, and
Sure. Well, I mean,
another
some
son on the
people,
way. But
yeah, they might say that would be particularly the moments of flourishing. I don't know, but I mean, so. Or another question would be, being a part of the Christian church that you're currently a part of, do you find a kind of pressure or effort to involve you with certain kinds of group actions that you feel uncomfortable with?
oh no, no, no,
Okay.
no. And it's actually, I mean, it's been a fantastic church community and definitely have very powerful experiences during worship. And yeah, I think, yeah, it's just a feeling of not being able to engage on certain levels or not
Yep.
not not being sure how to engage when it comes to certain topics. For example, evolution and Genesis, or another one is just the value of other Christian traditions.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, let's use that as an example, the evolution one. So it's the church that you're a part of currently is anti-evolution. Is that what you're saying?
a significant portion of people are. I mean, so to just make it concrete, for me it was important to get rebaptized, so I got rebaptized in this church, and then I felt like, I was called to find a spiritual mentor, so I reached out to our pastor, and he recommended I meet with like an elder of the church, and so we were talking, and I mean, it was really good. I found out he went to a seminary, ended up being Dallas Theological Seminary, which I didn't know much about. I was like, okay, that's cool. He's really well educated. We got to talking, and he mentioned how he used to be Catholic. He grew up Catholic, but he doesn't believe Catholics are Christian. And then, the topic of biblical interpretation came up, and he mentioned how, in Genesis, when it says day, it's a 24-hour period. You can know that if you know Hebrew. And it's a hitting a wall, you know?
Yeah. So
Uh
how would that perspective be of use to you as a spiritual mentor perspective?
yeah, and so I was like, not the guy.
Okay.
Not the
Oh, I
guy,
see. Okay. Okay.
So
Gotcha.
so it's like it's a feeling of, I mean, that's fine. Yeah, he's not like, this isn't the spiritual mentor God has for me. And so it's something like I mean, it's like it's good for what it's good for.
Well, but
There's
like here's what I want to dig into a little bit is like is and I because when I started asking these questions, my framing is I wanted to sort of see if like you could bracket, in the way that you're talking about sort of the truth claims of certain things and certain modes and just get sort of the benefits of the community and of the worship and of the liturgy and all that. But then what I wanted to see, so if you, for example, were like flourishing, happy, living a rich life, raising kids that were intellectually curious, who could grow and adopt any number of perspectives. You were open to other people, other worldviews, and could engage with, all that. And, open to science and to the insights of all that. And then it'd be sort of like, okay, cool. But then it starts to become like an issue here where this is kind of the thing that for me makes it very difficult, especially to participate in any group context where there are like profound worldview differences, right? So like if you think that like a billion people aren't Christian, like Catholics, let's say, and you're a Christian, you're like, and those people aren't Christians, which then usually in an evangelical context comes with the assumption that, there's the whole hell thing. So those people are going to suffer forever for eternity. And you don't cognize the scientific issues with a work like Genesis and seeing how that's not science and all that, then you can kind of consider the ripple effects of all that. Like, how does that then affect the world, right? Is this making the world better if like a bunch of people look over at that church and they're like, hey, I'm actually a Catholic, and they would say that I'm going to burn in hell forever? Or a scientist passes the church and like there they believe that the world was actually made in 6 days. And the kinds, and not just that kind of looking out, or I should say looking in from without, but how the church looks out and affects the world that it's a part of, right? Is it going to raise kids in the Sunday school to believe in a 6-day creation? And if so, what kind of stultification effect does that have on their understanding of reality? And are they going to teach them that, most other people are going to burn in hell? And then are they, what kind of impacts does that have on them psychologically and socially and all this stuff? So like, that's where the flourishing part, I feel like, starts to take a hit, right? And so that's kind of the issue. It's like if one can be a part of a religious community that fills their cup and makes life better for them and their family and their community, and allows them to live in a kind of openness with reality, in a way that's just generally, sort of, leading to everyone's well-being, then it's like, great. At that point, if you're doing all that and you believe whatever, it's almost like, well, who cares? But I get really hung up when the ideas themselves do actually have the impact of diminishing the well-being of others. And that's where like the propositional content does really start to matter in a way. So I don't know, how does any of that land for you?
Oh, totally. Oh, totally. I mean, it's a huge thing I wrestle with, because I think there's a point at which I feel like I will start to see that worldview impact my children's worldview. And I always think about, okay, how much can I counteract? How much of that messaging can I correct, after we leave church, in terms of like on the drive home, it's like, what'd you learn in Sunday school? God created the earth in 7 days. God created the world in 7 days. I mean, if they're 5, whatever, but
Right.
but by the time they start to understand the idea of like geological time scales, there's going to be conversations about that. That's one way to view it. And I think I'm always thinking, is this tolerable? Can I tolerate this? There's like a tolerance threshold. There's never going to be a faith community that's like, 100% where I'm at.
But see, that's what I'm like. I'm like, why? Like, why is that the case? Like, why can't we, as intelligent, intellectually oriented people who engage reality as best we can in as intellectually honest a way as possible, find a way of relating to reality in such a manner and come together and do that in a communal fashion that like does all the things that church does? Like that's what I'm trying to push for. And I feel like a lot of people very understandably are like, that can't exist, or we just have to deal with like some people, maybe most people, most congregations being really backwards and teaching our children false stories. But we have to make do. And I'm like, I don't know. I get the struggle, but it's like, yeah.
Yeah. No, yeah. Well, more power to you. I mean, I really don't want to rain on your parade. I think, for me, it's just where I'm situated. It's like, you have the ideas, but then like, where does it touch ground?
Well, where does it touch ground? What makes it all worth it, right? You have to go in, you have to think, I don't agree with a lot of these people about some of the core aspects of what they think reality is and how it works. And I have to correct for what they're teaching my children, but what? But I'm getting something else out of it. What's the but? What's the,
This is great. Well, it makes me think of, I think it was your conversation with Sam about a hierarchy of value.
Mm-hmm.
And when you were mentioning that, the image that came to mind was Christ, and the image of the angels ascending and descending
Mm-hmm.
on the Son of Man, and this idea that you know for for a Christian, Christ is kind of the pinnacle of the hierarchy of value. He is the jewel on the crown. And so to me, I think why it all is worth it is because in the hierarchy of value, there are higher values that this church community is providing. And a big one of those is it being a community of love and just raising our kids in this community of love. And if
Love,
they
except
have,
for Catholics and
oh,
except for
that's
all the
true.
people who don't
That
believe exactly the way you believe. Which is also interesting too, though, because by the standards of your own church, if they knew what you believed, maybe you'd be out. You know what I mean? Like, how does that work?
I wrestle with this. Yeah. Yeah. Man, and I think you're really touching a nerve there.
I don't mean to
Yeah.
be hard too. I mean, you
No, no,
asked
no, you're
for
great. You're
okay.
great.
This is
You're
yeah,
fantastic. I love it. I
perfect.
love it. No, you're wonderful. And I think this is where there's a little bit of a tension because it's like I'm like, how much of this is from me just kind of growing up Christian in a secular world where I have to kind of like in some ways hide my faith because it's seen as like, shameful or
Mm,
laughable by my, smarter peers. I mean, in this case, it's more like, I hide, the fact that I pray the rosary and, am very encouraged and fed by kind of Catholic devotional aspects of my faith. And I know, I mean, there are some people in my church that'd be fine, but, again, there are other people in authority in my church who, that like whiff of, I don't
mm.
know, something maybe satanic.
The whiff of popery, I think is what
No,
they used
the
to
whiff
call
of
it.
potpourri. Exactly. But I mean, this is how I think about it though. They're wrong. I
Mm,
mean, it's like that narrow-minded perspective is wrong.
mm-hmm,
Because if you see truth, if you see truth on a higher plane,
mm-hmm.
you can tell when someone is just narrow in their focus, when they
Yeah,
don't see the full picture.
yeah.
And so I don't want to dismiss, throw out, in some ways cut myself off from relationship with people who
Mm-hmm. Of
just don't see things the same way I do.
course.
But that feels like a tension because
Yeah.
I want to live with integrity. I want to be my full self
Mm-hmm.
in as much as it's appropriate, but there's a way in which I don't know. Not everyone can handle
Well, question.
who
I
I
mean,
am.
I'd be curious to know why the church where you are currently at, given all those dynamics that you're describing, seems like the one that is the right one for you. Like, there are churches, I'm sure, in your area that would be like, "Hey, you pray the rosary? Great, cool. We're open-minded people here." So why wouldn't one of those churches speak to you more?
I have a wife and a family.
Okay. Yeah, so there's more
It's
stakeholder interest to take into account. Yeah, yeah.
It's like yeah. I think if I were just on my own, I'd probably have already converted to Catholicism. But
Oh,
um,
interesting. So you're really there with that. That's fascinating. I mean, that's huge, to be
yeah,
honest. That's really important.
it's one of those things where you're looking through the window and you're
Yeah,
like, it
yeah.
looks really good in there
Mm.
until you open the door and step inside and you're inside for a while. It's kind of hard to tell if
Then you
that's
get
where
the
you
whole
actually want to live.
waft of
Yeah.
potpourri. I know.
Yeah.
I totally get that. But that is fascinating, though, that you feel like you're on the edge of this conversion to Catholicism and yet are in a church where ostensibly that would be, out of bounds or something, theologically, you'd be persona non grata or something. That's a really hard thing, too, because as you say, you're part of a family. And so I don't know where your wife's theology is at and all that, but you've got to navigate that and those dynamics. Then you'd have to decide, if you did want to actually follow your soul in that direction, like how do you raise your kids? Do you raise them in the Catholic Church? How does your wife feel about all that? And I'm sure that becomes an incredibly difficult set of interests to navigate.
Yeah. And I think honestly, there's something about the metamodern framing
Mm,
that it has been really helpful for me because it's a way of saying the beauty of traditional frameworks uh, without necessarily inhabiting them. Because I think there is something about traditional Catholicism that is in some ways kind of, narrow in its scope. I mean, traditional Catholics see, the Roman Catholic Church as the one true church
Mm-hmm.
to some extent. I mean, not everyone, but there's a way in which, I mean, let's say, as a Metamodern Christian, one can see just kind of the wealth of devotional practices, of liturgical prayers,
Mm-hmm.
the spiritual disciplines that
Mm-hmm.
have been kind of cultivated and safeguarded by this tradition in the West. And I think where I'm at is just I I think what attracts me to the Catholicism is just falling in love with the Western tradition, and
Mm.
the way I see it is the tradition of wrestling with the transcendent. You know,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
a legacy of wrestling with the transcendent and cultivating spiritual practices in the West, which, I mean, the Catholic Church has just been for so much of Western history. I mean, it is the arc that has carried that
Mm.
forward. And I think for me growing up non-denominational, that chest was just like, it was up in the attic and they said, don't go up there. Don't
Mm.
open that chest.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
here I snuck up there and I looked in the chest and it's full of all these amazing things. And
That's so
I
funny,
just
just as an aside, by the way, because if you've ever read A Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde flirted with Catholicism in a very similar way, largely for aesthetic reasons, right? It's
okay,
just,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but I mean, that's nothing to shake a stick at. Like the Catholic Church
Yeah.
has a profound aesthetic tradition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, there's this scene where I think it's Dorian is up in like an attic and he's going through this chest full of like, yes, the kind of stuff that you find in a sacristy, with all like the goblets and everything. And he's just there. I have this vague memory of this scene anyway, but it's just kind of funny because it maps kind of to what you're talking about. Because there's this flirtation with high church and all of its kind of, yeah, its aura and its, patina and its beauty, sublimity even is very real. But another question though is, it sounded like, you were married and you went through this period of sort of modern disenchantment for like years and called
Yeah.
yourself an agnostic. And it sounded like, your family at the time, I guess maybe just your wife at the time because you hadn't had kids yet, was sort of like with you for that, right? I mean, there was like you were maybe supported in some way. I mean, you're I don't I mean also at this point maybe we're getting into personal stuff. I don't want to get into
Oh
like,
yeah.
marriage dynamics, but I just mean like where my question is leading is if you've already gone through a period where of searching and maybe moving out of the orbit of your childhood faith and even your wherever your spouse is at and you're still all good, it would seem to me that like that would be strong enough to support a similar excursion and maybe more than an excursion, a conversion into, a different faith tradition, but maybe not.
Not so much. I mean, yeah,
Okay.
it's something that yeah, she's kind of closed the door on that. And I just have to trust you know, we're married for a reason. And I think in
Hmm.
some ways, a good wife can serve as almost like a railing
Hmm.
to keep you in a certain bound.
Sure. Yeah.
I think I just see in myself, my mind just kind of can roam free and
Uh-huh.
I can just go off. And in some ways, my wife and my family, they kind of keep me
Yeah.
on the home range in a
Yep.
good way. Sometimes
Uh-huh.
I
Yeah.
run up against that fence and I get frustrated, but
Yeah. No, that's very
that's good.
true.
That's good,
And you've got,
to some degree.
Nietzsche talked about amor fati, the love of fate, and I think that there's something very uh flourishing, supporting in embracing the context in which you find yourself and affirming it as the context in which you're supposed to be operating in, seeing it in those
Yes,
terms, right?
yes, yes.
And so, another aspect to this, I do think though, is that sort of like you'd want to probe into like again like to return to the why of engagement, not just with specific traditions but with certain ways of seeing the world in a Christian frame. Like what I would want to suggest, right, is that from a particular vantage here, I'll say it this way. I popped into a TLC live stream and people
Okay.
were talking about, I think Paul Vanderklay was talking about ecumenicism and how, was TLC kind of an ecumenical or ecumenicist sort of movement and all this
Yeah.
stuff. And then And he was sort of like, nah, because, ultimately, we can't do communion together. Like if, I don't know, Grim
Yeah.
Grizz or whoever is, we're all in the, together, we can't partake in the sacrament of communion as one. And to me, I just kind of chimed in like, what do you think you're doing right now? You are literally communing. Ooh, there I go again. Ah, the spirit has.
You're
Let me see if I
behind the
can fix that.
veil.
I mean, oh no, there
You're
we go.
back.
I'm back. So my argument was sort of like, this is communion. Like you're all coming
Yeah.
together, you're showing love, and you're in relationship with one another, and you are in a church together. Like people don't see that, but like TLC is a kind of church. It's an
Yeah, an
ecumenical
ecclesia.
church where
Yeah.
where people are together. And yes, there are theological differences, profound ones in many cases. In some cases, even cross-religious, dialogue is happening. So, but I thought it was just very ironic because there was this sense of sadness of like, yeah, that's all going on, but it's not real church because church has to do with, I guess eating a particular kind of bread and believing certain things about it. And then if it's not that, then it's not church. And for me, speaking of the
Yeah.
narrow
Yeah.
mindedness, it's sort of
Yeah.
like, yeah, Jesus is like the Sabbath was for man, not man for the Sabbath. And when we think that church is about the right word said about the right thing and the right order and how we interpret it theologically, and that's what communion is supposed to be about, I just see that as missing out on all the like broader, more transcendental aspects of what is actually going on there. So I mention all that because, I think that like a metamodern orientation to spirituality and specifically to Christianity would be one pushing us in the direction to see church as that bigger thing and not the smaller thing. And so it would be ridiculous,
Yeah.
ludicrous to suggest that like we aren't doing communion together, or I won't count myself a part of that community because I don't know, I'm probably not, but in some way I am, I guess, I don't know. But the point being, right, that like
Yeah.
it is communion. And so to bring us all back from a vantage, like it matter if you are confirmed in a particular church. It doesn't matter what church you're baptized into. Does it matter all that stuff? Or as you say, if in your mind you're able to go to these places, then you can start to see from that higher vantage that these are maybe just strictures that don't fully apply to your kind of spiritual state, which maybe you're just, Catholic by spiritual nature, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that you therefore are have to be a secret Catholic, a repressed Catholic who like can't take the Eucharist and all this stuff. Do you see what I mean though? Because
Yeah,
it's like that's not
absolutely.
really the point. So that would be
Yes. Yes. Yes.
my thought. The point though really is, right? The point is, where does communion stop? And it stops when people are like, that person's out and that
Yeah.
person, isn't right. And let's talk, this person isn't right for all these reasons. Then you're not doing communion anymore. And that would be where it really does matter what a church is about. And that's why for me, it's like what Paul said, right? Blessed is he who is does not what how does that go? Is in the context of like eating meat sacrificed to pagan gods. It's like blessed is he who is not condemned by what he can affirm, right? So for your brother in Christ who's like, I can't eat this meat because it's sacrificed to pagan idols, and that's not okay. Like Paul's like, okay, no, people want to do that, that's fine. And if some people do eat that meat, that's great too. But they're actually in a kind of more broad-minded perspective because
Yeah.
they're just going to do with, And so I think
Yeah.
that that's kind of the perspective is blessed is he
Yeah.
who's condemned by what he affirms. Whereas if you start condemning things, then you start, and I'm not saying that we can't say no and draw boundaries and, all that. It's very important that we define things and are clear and make distinctions. But the ethical component of religion and the church is much more about the openness and the seeing your neighbor as everyone and all of that. And so if we orient ourselves to a church like that, then these divisions, don't have to be such a big deal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. And I think that's such a great framing. St. Paul's relationship with, say, like the Judaizing element of early
Hmm.
Christianity
Hmm.
versus the Gentile element. And
Yeah.
and there's a way in which one can allow those who need to exist within strict boundaries to
Hmm.
maintain those strict boundaries. You can allow that
Hmm.
while also allowing a more openness
Hmm.
and respecting those who need
Yeah.
those narrow constraints, which is, I mean, that's very much how I feel in our church context where, I'm going to church with people who, for them, their faith is very much tied to a more literal reading of the Bible. And so I'm just not going to come out and try to,
Yeah.
smash their interpretation of Genesis because it
Right.
disagrees with mine. And that's where I think I try to be sensitive. I don't want to be a stumbling block. Anyway, I just respect that they are on their own journey in some ways. And so for me it's like a finding that right relationship. That right way of being in relation
Yeah.
with someone like that.
And again, it sounds like if you were totally left to your own devices, you might find yourself in a different kind of spiritual community. But given, the love of fate and the particular dynamics that you're operating within, and those constraints that are generative constraints as well, I think that that's a very healthy way of looking at it. And but also I would probably presume that there's a certain vigilance that would have to go on in that context. You can't just, as you say, like send your kids off to Sunday school and then not necessarily have in the back of your mind, I'm not sure what they're going to be taught today. And that's got to be, that's hard. I mean, there's a degree to which, right, like it's like you're basically to some degree a Catholic in an anti-Catholic environment. Maybe that overstates it, but there's some degree of which, like, LGBTQ folks might find themselves in a church that is non-affirming, right? And then what do? And it's the same sort of thing. They have to kind of be like, oh, I'm not being. And so I just feel like, I don't know. The direction of the Christ is to move into, more open and expansive views where those divisions are precisely what gets broken down. I mean, that's for me why Jesus is the jewel in the crown of the hierarchy of value, if you want to think about it, because it's like, oh, wow, look how expansive he was. There's a reason why Caiaphas isn't the jewel of the crown. You know what I mean? It's like, there's a kind of narrow-minded legalism there that Jesus was pushing people to see beyond. So I don't know. I mean, yeah, I guess, you can say all that in theory, but then obviously you've got to deal with the on the ground social dynamics, cultural dynamics, family dynamics, and that's where the rubber really meets the road. So
exactly.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And I think just going back to tradition and kind of a relationship with tradition, I feel like honestly, a lot of your discussion of metamodern Christianity has in some ways given me, it's almost like the permission to take the gold from tradition without feeling like I have to identify fully in that tradition, if that makes sense. Like I think there's a way of relating to the past where one can, right? I mean, just carry on the good without feeling like one has to live in the full trappings, if that, but I think in some ways it can almost feel like a cosplay or like I don't want to just be collecting knickknacks, from traditions. I don't, but is there any other way in our current context?
Well, that's the thing is I don't think so. Here's the thing. So yeah, this is often the critiques that come up is people will say, well, this toggling thing doesn't seem very integrated. It seems very schizo and blah, blah, blah. So that's one thing. The other thing is, there's this sense of, well, why not just do tradition essentially? Because some people will, see something disingenuous about this.
Yeah.
But then it's like, for me on the latter point, it's like, what's your offer? Like how do we, do we forget everything that we've learned? Do we go ahead and burn the books and everything and just say no? Like, no, like, and so even Paul Vanderklay, God bless him, he will say these things about like, we talk a big thing about tradition, but like we do, do we even like spending time with our family? And we talk about going to church and doing the liturgy, but are we just sort of, but it's like, what are you advocating instead? Like how do we go back to some period in time where we can fully inhabit the worldview that generated these beautiful, wonderful things that people love? Like, yes, cathedrals are gorgeous, but if you want to go back to fully inhabit what created that cathedral, then you've got to give up on women's rights and evolution and, engineering and modern medicine. And it's like, so I think that's a bit disingenuous, is to suggest that there's somehow this alternative, that this other thing is missing, but I don't know what that alternative is. Now, that being said, personally, I don't go the route of, oh, I can just toggle into this view when needed, and then I can toggle out of it when I need to deal with, other things. Like personally, I do see a meta level integration of all these things at a certain level. And I think that there you can get very specific about what that looks like and how. There's a reason why I don't go to church, like I don't I for me, that is not an option anymore because maybe just because, how do I say? Some of this might be biographically oriented in the sense that like I just have too many bad associations with this stuff. I might have just too much of an allergy to the kinds of dynamics that play out when people want to preach to me about something that I don't think is real or want to use certain dynamics to castigate and blame other people or not even blame because it all comes from a very well-intentioned perspective, but it's like, I hate to say it, but only this very small group of people will not burn eternally in hell. And like all of that stuff is too hard for me to deal with. I'm also, I don't know, maybe I'm an introvert. I also I'm not raising kids, so there's not this sense of like
Yeah.
needing the social fabric and all that. And so for me, it's much better to find my church in the woods and to engage with creation and reality in a very different way. But all that said, I think that there's a way to maintain a deeply, Christian perspective that isn't just, the schizoid moving back and forth between like, oh, now I'm doing in the ritual and I'm inhabiting a medieval perspective. And now I have to work on my, 9 to 5 job stuff. And I don't think that that's the way of looking at it. I think it's much more, there's a continuous worldview that is nested all of the aspects of value in these different perspectives. So like liturgy and ritual and the aura of entering a beautiful sacred space and the kind of reverential attitude that draws out of you and all of that stuff, like that's the good stuff of tradition, right?
Right.
But you can do all of that and you can affirm all of that without then having to say, oh, okay, and I guess for right now I think that the world was made in 6 days. Like you don't have to do that. I can relate to a fully modern understanding of science and reality and evolution and engage in ritual and liturgy and this sort of a thing. And I do think that there will be the possibility for people in the future, starting now, to generate these kinds of metamodern Christian spaces where people don't feel like they have to, hide aspects of their critical mind, but where those things are actually celebrated. And I do think you can have the full stack operating. It's just, those spaces don't exist yet. And so it's
Yeah,
a lot
or
easier to operate in what already exists.
yeah, or I mean it exists kind of in my like philosophy book club.
Yeah,
Or like in certain circles or conversations that are happening on YouTube. Like
exactly.
it's
But that's
it
isn't that church? That's my
yeah,
whole
oh
thing,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I want people to think, that yeah, I mean, where two or more are gathered, that's where it happens. But then it's like it's not just any old two. It's like, it depends on the kinds of dialogos that can come out and the kind of how much of yourself you can share with other people. How much do you feel you're going to be judged or ostracized if you don't say certain things? Like
Yes.
true community is like, oh, I see you, man. I love you, man. I love you just the way you are for all your foibles. And I also think you're a genuinely cool dude. I'm not just loving you because universal love. I don't keep friendships if I don't genuinely enjoy people's company. Right. And I don't think we should. So anyway, like that's real community and connection. And I don't know. That's the kind of church that I look for.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, I'm not trying to suggest these are easy answers because, there are all these other aspects have to be factored in and that's very hard. And so I want to also honor that and not just like, pretend like it's an easy thing. But I do want to try to make the case, at least for my own work and what I'm trying to communicate to people, that like I don't think that we have to face the situation with a kind of, all right, I'll just adopt a traditional perspective more or less wholesale because this allows my world to be reenchanted. I don't think that's quite the right solution. It's like I want to bring everything into the not well. I want to bring all the best stuff into the future and leave what doesn't work behind, right? And so
Oh yeah.
I'll put it this way. I don't think that there's a necessary trade-off in, well, to have good church, you have to kick out and blame Catholics and say they're going to go to hell, right? or to have good church, you have to think that there's, a 6-day creation. Like these are not necessarily related. And I guess that's the thing I'm trying to go. Anyway, I'll stop rambling and soapboxing, but my kind of approach.
Yeah, yeah. No, this is great. Well, yeah, I know we approached the hour mark. I definitely
Yeah,
want
I
to
got
be
to go pretty
respectful
soon, but
of your
I
time.
hope this was, I mean, I hope, I mean, it's such an interesting thing for me right now to like be having these conversations with folks. Because on the one hand, as you say, there's so much shared experience and shared perspective and all of that. And there's this really interesting kind of flowering tree branching as how people right now are dealing with all of these things and what sense they're making of it. And I admittedly am trying to articulate and make the case for a particular way to go on these things.
Oh yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
I don't want to, other people can do other things. And honestly, as long as people are flourishing and they're increasing their well-being and the well-being of their community and all of that, then it's sort of like, it's that's what matters. I just how we do that, I think, is really important. And I also say the last thing I'll say is that, you know, still very much in my family, there are some people who are deeply conservative in their faith still. And so I know what it's like to have to navigate those dynamics and it's hard, and it's like there's a kind of translation process and there's also a kind of volatility there that you have to tiptoe around certain things, certain issues, or like, yeah, kind of keep your cards close to your chest or whatever. So, yeah, it's a difficult thing, but I guess I'll just leave it in the uncertainty and the confusion because, I don't want to say that there are simple, easy answers. But I really enjoyed
Yeah.
this. Thank you so
Yeah,
much,
no,
for
this is great.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I again, thank you so much for being generous with your time. I'm just, some random person from Arkansas. It's just the fact that you're
Well,
willing to talk with me for
what are
an hour.
your concluding thoughts at the moment, reflections as we come to a
Um,
close?
yeah, well, I feel like you're charting a path forward. I don't think it's the only path, but it's definitely a path forward. And I think the interesting thing is living in the context of having communities of different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost and I feel like again, that, like this meta modern framework is a great way of just being aware
Mm-hmm.
and entering these different spaces and
Yeah.
understanding where they fit and
Mm-hmm.
how one relates to them
Mm-hmm.
and almost developing the perspective that contains perspectives and seeing the value and necessity in those other perspectives
Mm-hmm.
without, for me, what's been very helpful is not having to take an antagonistic
Mm.
perspective towards people in my life who inhabit a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to say you're wrong and I'm right. I can see them as being in the stage of development, which is where they're supposed to be, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, for most of them, like I was there at one point, and any
Yep.
antagonism I feel towards
Right.
that is just because
Yeah.
I, see that in myself and feel like I've moved past it.
Yeah.
But I don't know. For some way, I feel like you've really helped me have a perspective on this that allows me to love people where they are. And I mean, just one more thing. I shared one of your videos. I think it's kind of just specifically on metamodern Christianity. I shared that with my dad, who's like kind of, it feels like at the end of his deconstruction experience, and he
Mm.
found it really helpful, and I'm looking forward to conversations with him. And so it's just really beautiful how I think the way you're framing this is allowing, I mean, for example, myself and my dad to
Yeah.
have a conversation. So
That's great.
anyway, so thank you.
Yeah, well, and just one more thought about that. And this is what I struggle with and what I'm trying to make the most sense of at the moment. Because I'm really glad to hear all of that. And that I think is the major takeaway of the whole metamodern thing is like, oh yeah, different perspectives and to value each for what it is doing in context and to also appreciate that there's a sequence and everything you just said is like so perfect. So I'm really glad that that's the major takeaway that people are getting from it all. Where it becomes where I'm still struggling with what it all means is that like I can understand, for example, that like someone might be coming at something from a particular like, very maybe conservative traditional stance perspective. And I can get that. I can value it. I've been there. I know it. I've been through it. All right. And if they want to attack me, I'm like, yep, I would have said the exact same thing. And so there's compassion and empathy and there's value and all that stuff. What I don't know what to do about is when that person goes out with their church and let's just say, I don't know, pickets an abortion clinic or starts, trying to engage engage in political action to limit people's rights, or or has to tell a friend in as nice a way as they possibly can, yeah, I do think that your gay son is going to burn in hell.
Yeah.
Those things to me are wrong. And it's like, I don't, if you value development and you value that there is something beyond relativity, then you have to take a stance, and an ethical one, and say, yeah, like that's not right. Now, that becomes then the hard thing, is like, what is the place for that perspective in this broader set of perspectives, and how do we relate to folks who do these things in a loving way, all of that, right? But like, if you also think about what Jesus was about and the kinds of people he called broods of vipers, and all this stuff, like, he wasn't too kind to that sort of thing either. So I think that that's why, again, I just want to keep emphasizing that, like, while there is this set of perspectives that we can relate to and have a perspective on, I think that there is something beyond the relativism of all of that that says, actually, that hierarchy of value, that jewel in the crown, is the perspective that, that is more open, more loving, that's more, that sees more neighbors than others, right? Who's my neighbor? It's like, well, who's in my church? Who's in the flock? Who are the sheep and who are the goats? It's like, oh, how we answer those questions really matters. And if we say that they don't, then it's almost like Christianity doesn't matter. So there does seem to be this sense in which Christianity moves through its own deconstruction in a way that actually you get beyond it and you're like, oh, this is what Christianity is about. So I guess that's the last thing I'll say about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I agree. And there aren't easy answers to that.
Yeah. I'd love to hear more about your farm at some point and your chickens. That sounds awesome. By the way, before we go, where are you? What is this barn you're in? What is the structure? You building your own house?
This is my office. So, yeah, I said we have twin boys. They're 3 years old. We're about to have another set of twins.
Oh, wow. Congrats.
Yeah, which is amazing. We're having to make space in our house, so we got this prefab shed put in our backyard for me to have an office space and have more storage space. So
Lovely.
I'm still working on it. Anyway, I had put it on the back burner till I finished the new bedroom for the babies, so I haven't drywalled it yet. So
Gotcha.
Anyway, that's what
you're a handy man. I love it. And I bet we could nerd out maybe to some degree talking about permaculture and horticulture at some point.
Absolutely, yes.
And
yes.
Yeah. Cool, man. Well, I really enjoyed this. Thanks so much for the invitation, and glad we could chat. Happy to do it again when my schedule opens up a little bit more. And just, I always feel that way with folks of like, these are ongoing conversations, and it also really, it helps, I don't know. It helps me clarify my own thinking and clarify the knots in my thinking and all that stuff. So I'll also throw out the necessary caveat of like, as much as hopefully this stuff is valuable, and I love to hear that people are finding it that way, there's an edge to the thought that's still being clarified and developed, and I don't have all the answers and would never claim to. And so thanks for working these things out together. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's been a huge pleasure. I would love to talk again.
All right. Well, take care, my friend. Godspeed. God bless.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Same.
Bye.
Bye.